Good afternoon. I'm delighted to be here at this very interesting conference, and I'd like first of all to thank Dr. Christoph Falkenroth and Dr. Marion Esch for inviting me to speak. The title of my talk, Lone Heroines or Team Players, Role Models or Modelling Roles for Equal Opportunities in STEM, is intended to draw our attention to the potential risk of assuming that a role model should be a lone heroine rather than a team player, and to pose the question of whether it may be more appropriate to represent women in STEM as ordinary members of teams in the workplace rather than as exceptional and potentially isolated individuals. It also alludes to one of the key differences between film and television drama series, particularly those which enjoy long runs, and that is their production as vehicles for stars or for ensemble casts. So, the research project, of which I can only give a brief overview today about the media representation of women in STEM careers in the UK, was commissioned by the UK Resource Centre for Women in Science, Engineering and Technology. The UKRC Centre was disbanded in 2012 and taken into another organisation called WISE, so slightly suffering the vagaries of funding gender initiatives. But they commissioned the research because, like many of you here today, the organisation was concerned about the potential influence of and impacts upon women's careers of such media representations. In the project, we pursued 4 different work strands, only one of which I can present to you today, but each work strand cross-fertilised the other. The other reports were role models in the media, gender stereotypes and expertise in the press, and promoting women in the media. So, today, what I'm going to do is begin by discussing what women in SET, and I'm probably going to move between talking about SET, which was the previous acronym in the UK for this area of careers, and STEM, because some places I updated it and some places I didn't, but we're talking about the same thing. It's what you call MINT. So I'll begin by discussing what these women had to say about media representations of women in SET STEM. I'll then move on to discuss our analysis of TV dramas. Specifically, I'm going to focus on the ways in which women in STEM, the professionals, are represented in TV drama series. I'll provide an overview of the key themes we explored and discuss the extent to which those can be understood as positive, negative, or ambivalent representations. I'm also going to report on some interviews conducted with members of the production teams of the UK dramas to give some insight into the possibilities and constraints which such TV dramas offer for the representation of women professionals in STEM. And I'm going to conclude by outlining just a few of the recommendations that we made, which I believe are very much in tune with the approach of MINTiFF to science in television drama. Excuse me. So, the perennial question, what do women want? And what do women in STEM or SET want? We began our project by collecting data from 86 women working in or training to work in SET or STEM careers. And through a combination of focus groups and individual interviews, we explored their experiences of growing up, the type of role models that were available to them at that time, and we also asked about the types of media that they now enjoyed consuming and how they would like to see women in STEM represented. Their responses highlighted concern about the low profile of women in STEM and criticisms of stereotypical representations which framed women scientists as, for example, dowdy, socially isolated, or over-emotional. Surprise, surprise. They also highlighted a debate among female scientists about certain aspects of media representation, such as the extent to which the media should profile the difficulties women face in male-dominated workplaces or the challenges facing working mothers. So, as I've suggested, research participants reported a distinct dearth of media representations of women in STEM, but on probing them, it became apparent that this dearth was mainly with regard to factual representations of real women and their work, particularly in newspapers and in TV news. By contrast, TV documentaries were sometimes mentioned quite positively, and television and film fiction were often recognised as exceptions to this rule of invisibility. Indeed, dramatic representations of women in STEM generated lengthy comments in interview and animated discussions in the focus groups. Thus, despite the perception, and in fact the claims made by some of our interviewees that women in STEM just don't have time to view film or TV fiction, this perception wasn't borne out by our research. In fact, a number of our respondents voiced strong and detailed responses to dramatic representations of women scientists. So, we selected the sample of film and television series that we analysed to reflect those which were most often mentioned by our research participants. In addition to the 4 TV series franchises that I've put up in the slide, there were also 3 films analysed that we mentioned that we analysed, but I haven't included them today for purposes of time, and also because I'm biased towards television. But in the case of the series selected for viewing, there was already an extensive corpus available. This research was conducted in 2008, and I'd like to rerun it again to see what has changed, if anything, in the meantime. But at that point, there had been 10 series of Silent Witness, for example, now 16, and 15 seasons in total of the 3 iterations of CSI. There are now 32. We couldn't therefore simply watch one episode and then make meaningful statements about how Silent Witness or CSI represented women in STEM. So we dealt with this by analysing pilot episodes and then comparing them with later episodes, particularly those that showed changes in the format. For example, with CSI, it was illuminating to compare the shows set in different locations with distinct identities. With Silent Witness, one of the British series, we compared episodes from Series 1 with episodes from Series 8 for reasons that I will explain later. So, all of the research team viewed some of the selected programmes together and discussed themes that emerged and how they related to evidence from questionnaires, interview material and the discussions in focus groups, as well as to emerging data from our analysis of newspaper reporting. From our discussions of the programmes viewed and thinking about them in relation to material gathered from our research participants, we decided to develop thematic categories to organise our subsequent analysis of the wealth of material to be viewed. These categories were chosen to relate to key ideas about positive and negative representations raised by our research participants. So the themes that we used were as follows: casting and share of narrative time, represented hierarchies, battle of the sexes, which is actually a kind of a subcategory of represented hierarchies, relationships between scientists and non-scientists, and the degree of focus on private life. And to the extent that this last issue could be explored, we explored gendered career and life course issues, and gender, emotion and rationality. So although we selected the TV series because of perceptions voiced by our research participants that they had key roles for women scientists, this didn't necessarily mean that women were the lead actors, the top-ranked cast members. In fact, this was the exception rather than the rule. So in terms of the USA dramas, even in Bones, the most modern of the 4 series considered, the eponymous Bones, the actor Emily Deschanel shares star billing with David Boreanaz, who plays her FBI agent partner in crime fighting. Further, his name appears higher up on the shared credit screen. The CSI dramas, which are all based on the interactions of teams of forensic scientists, again, nevertheless, give star billing to the leading men who head up the fictional teams. Even in PR vehicles for the show, the importance of the leading men is emphasised. But the casting does give some appearance, apparently, of equality, or maybe it's dinner table seating, as the screen credits typically alternate between male and female actors in descending order of narrative centrality on star billing. In terms of the UK dramas, Silent Witness, the earliest of the 4 series that we considered, it was first screened in 1996, was created to be centred on a lone female and a strong female protagonist, and starred Amanda Burton, cast as Sam Ryan, a senior forensic pathologist, for 5 of the 10 series aired to 2008. However, in the 6th and 7th series, 2 new male lead characters, both forensic pathologists, were introduced, with the character of Leo gradually occupying a larger share of narrative time. And in Series 8, the character of Sam Ryan was written out altogether and a new female lead character introduced, third on the billing. In the case of Waking the Dead, the 2 women scientists, a profiling psychologist and a pathologist, both act as foils to the lead character and first credited cast member, Peter Boyd, played by Trevor Eve. And their role in the narrative and share of narrative time is largely organised in subordinate relation to that of Boyd, Eve. However, there are important narrative interactions between the women scientists that don't feature him. So it's arguable that the cast order and apportionment of narrative time is a plausible and responsible representation of the state of affairs that exists in the real world, as the characters of Temperance Brennan and Sam Ryan, both based on real-life senior forensic scientists, are exceptional in the degree to which they become renowned experts. It's more likely, again, that in real life, women in STEM will occupy less senior niches in professional hierarchies. Comparing UK and US televisual treatments of STEM workplaces, it does appear that US dramas are more effective in their representations of diversity and equity in casting and share of narrative time, but that white men are still largely in the lead, both in the fictional scenarios and in the credits. And I think this bears further research because this doesn't necessarily square with the differences in legislation around gender in the workplace between the US and the UK. In terms of represented hierarchies, there's obviously a close relationship between this category and the previous one of cast order and narrative time. So, in the TV series that we analysed, the procedural nature of the dramas firmly located them in workplace settings as well as at the scene of crimes. So, represented hierarchies are essential both for realism and for dramatic tension. In Waking the Dead and the 3 CSI franchises, the women characters, psychologists, pathologists and crime scene investigators are all represented as competent and often passionately committed in relation to their work. They're represented as having significant expertise that's materially essential to the solving of crimes and to the resolution of the narratives, and yet the heads of their units are all men. So it's up to you whether you view that as a thumbs up or a thumbs down. It could be viewed as problematic or else as realistic, reflecting real-world employment trends, similar to what you were saying just before the break. So, in terms of the represented hierarchies, both Silent Witness and Bones represent exceptional women, one based in the UK and one in the US. So Silent Witness, as I've already suggested, is renowned in the UK, both for starting a flood of women into STEM courses in the UK, but for introducing a female pathologist as its star. And Amanda Burton played Sam Ryan as an authoritative and effective scientist for 5 series. For the latter 2 series in which she appeared throughout, however, the plot formula changed from revolving around Sam, Amanda as the star and lead investigator, and focused more on her relationship and tensions between her and her colleagues, 2 male scientists, one of whom was vying for her job. In the 8th series, Sam Ryan was written out altogether in the first episode, and her character was replaced by that of Nikki Alexander, played by Amelia Fox, who was initially identified as a forensic anthropologist. So Fox is a much younger actor without the gravitas of Sam Amanda and is taken on as a junior team member, significantly altering the dynamic of represented hierarchies. Again, in the youngest of the series that we considered, Bones, this series is marketed as inspired by the life of forensic anthropologist and author Kathy Reichs, and its central character, Temperance Brennan, is, like her real-life model, an authoritative expert who directs a team of scientific specialists. Her line manager is a relatively minor character, her male line manager, and Brennan is represented as a genius and something of a maverick. So Kathy Reichs is a renowned expert in her field and is a consultant on the series, so this may account for the capacity of this series in particular to maintain a women scientist as an acknowledged authority. And as I've suggested, our research only considered the first season of Bones, so it's very interesting to note that a female line manager takes a much more prominent role in later episodes, as does a female intern. So I'm a big fan of Bones, I have to confess. I mean, I think they do really interesting things with gender relations and really problematic ones as well. But taking out the kind of the male-female dynamic at the top of the hierarchy is one of their more interesting innovations. So the relationship between fact and fiction in the representation of gendered hierarchies may be perceived in a number of ways. Again, it's up to you whether it's a thumbs up or a thumbs down. We could celebrate that such dramas represent competent women in STEM with reasonable degrees of seniority, working in largely supportive mixed-sex teams, and potentially even statistically overrepresenting the effective penetration of women into such workplaces. Alternatively, we could bemoan the fact that with the exception of Bones and the early Silent Witness series, women aren't represented as the lead expert. The fictional protagonists of these dramas echo the exceptional status and success of the women who inspire the dramas, who are both nationally renowned in their respective countries as expert witnesses with senior academic posts. So, again, that's an interesting thing to consider with regard to the relationship between advisors and dramatists. So, I mentioned Battle of the Sexes as kind of as a subset of the issue of gendered hierarchies, and I'm calling this template one which represents struggles for dominance and acknowledgement of expertise in the context of a potential romantic or erotic entanglement between heterosexual protagonists. This research was motivated by a commitment to improving the representation of women in STEM careers and in the media. And this commitment isn't about displacing men from the STEM workplace, but about enabling equal access for women. However, as I'm sure many of you are aware, equality-based objectives are often perceived as threatening and disruptive to a natural order which views men as having primary responsibility for the public sphere of work and women as having primary responsibility for the sphere of home and family. The Battle of the Sexes template is a dramatic exploration and management of such threats to the natural order, albeit one that has been updated to recognise that women do occupy important places in the public world of work. So the template uses heterosexual desire and the deferral of its consummation through verbal sparring and competition around professional achievement to displace struggles around gender and power or hierarchy to a more congenial register. And of the series considered, Bones in particular is very overtly structured around a battle of the sexes, with Temperance Brennan and the FBI agent Celie Booth always struggling to gain the upper hand in dialogue and in professional achievement. So it follows in a long tradition of such TV dramas, particularly from the US, including Moonlighting and The X-Files, and the same power struggle dynamic, often with a strand of humour, and acknowledged or unacknowledged erotic undercurrents can be traced back to Hollywood films of the 1940s, like His Girl Friday and Adam's Rib. And in more recent series, this battle has been tempered as Brennan and Booth become partners at home as well as at work, and is also echoed, one of my least favourite aspects, through other heterosexual workplace-home pairings. And again, this could be viewed through a deficit lens as inappropriately shifting the focus from women's professionalism to their desirability. Alternatively, it could be viewed more positively as representing women in STEM careers as ordinary in the challenges they face. Such represented power struggles could also be understood as recognising that it's no longer possible or acceptable to take the assignment of women to inferior positions in home or in the workplace for granted. So again, what do women want to see represented of their fictional professional peers? Some of our research participants wanted women scientists to be portrayed as normal or ordinary, while others wanted their distinctiveness highlighted. So in analysing the representations of relationships between scientists and non-scientists, we attempted to investigate whether the relationships were that were portrayed drew on stereotypes regarding science or regarding gender, or whether other narrative rationales were provided for conflicts between scientists and non-scientists. And when I say relationships, I generally mean conflict. Conflict, as you all know, is very important in drama and is deployed very effectively in each of these series. So as I've said already, our sample is heavily based on crime procedural dramas. And this means that the key relationships between scientists and non-scientists that are represented on screen involve either the victims of crime or other professionals involved with law and criminology more generally. Murder, as we heard earlier, or violent death is generally at the heart of plots. So this raises the stakes in the interpersonal relationships portrayed in ways that would be unlikely to arise if other areas of STEM careers were being represented in such a procedural fashion. Well, one has to hope. We don't want to see this in many labs. So tension in the relationships between scientists and non-scientists in the fictional cold case squad in Waking the Dead, one of the BBC dramas, emerges in narrative conflict, but it's generally regarded and represented as a creative tension that leads to results. A similar dynamic is in play in Bones, although the tensions here are explored with much more humour. This humour, counterpoint to the gravity of the crimes investigated, is typically organised around two axes. And these are the general relationships between the forensic scientists, or squints as they're called, and non-scientists, usually members of the FBI, and the specific relationship between Bones, the forensic anthropologist, and Seeley Booth, the FBI agent. And this latter relationship, which stands in for the larger institutional relationship, is the competitive one, as I've already suggested, with each character repeatedly trying to demonstrate that their method of fact-finding is superior. There's continual readjustment as one or other gets the upper hand, leading to a situation of mutual respect that's occasionally undermined by mutual incomprehension of different worldviews. In the CSI franchise, the relationship between the crime scene investigators and other legal professionals is generally represented as more harmonious than is the case in Bones, Waking the Dead or Silent Witness. But again, this is possibly due to the institutional location of these fictional crime scene investigators who are represented as providing a direct service to other crime fighters. That said, different characters within the respective teams in CSI, CSI Miami and CSI New York occupy different positions on the spectrum of abstracted to socially embedded in relation to their degree of investment in the science and technology versus their investments in providing closure and solace to families of murder victims. So in this analysis, what we're suggesting is that different generic and plotting strategies are implicated in the representations of relationships between scientists and non-scientists, or, as I suggested, conflicts between them. We'd also suggest that stereotypes about different worldviews and methods of gathering knowledge are deployed reflectively for dramatic purposes and are not necessarily attributable to any inherent bias against science or women scientists on the part of the writers and producers of such dramas. We've reflected on the extent to which humorous treatments of the tensions in such relationships seem to reach the screen with less constraint in the USA than in the UK. And I wonder if it's related to what you were talking about earlier about German do-gooders. But it's an interesting distinction. We'd further argue that the different knowledge cultures of scientists and non-scientists are represented as complementary and in creative tension with each other in a way that we feel locates STEM and STEM practitioners positively in networks of social and professional relationships. And so we think that it's important that rather than considering such dramas as flawed or deficient representations of ideal conditions in STEM or idealised role models in STEM, that they're recognised as plausibly representing and critiquing the social relations of STEM and the ambivalent investments that women in those careers have in their professional and personal lives. So, the focus of the cinematic or televisual gaze on young, glamorous women has been the subject of extensive feminist critique within the Academy, as well as a perennial source of discontent for mature women actors. And on that topic, it would be interesting to interview Amanda Burton. But with this theme, we were interested in the degree to which the representations of women scientists, experts, appeared of necessity to require more mature women actors, as well as providing dramatic opportunities to explore the costs and benefits to women of working in STEM workplaces. The dramas that we analysed, however, focused primarily on the public sphere, and private life was alluded to largely peripherally, either as a motivator for characters' professional lives or to the degree to which it impacts on the performance of their professional roles. One of the most interesting aspects of the CSI franchise, as many people have commented, is the number of central roles that it provides for women in their 30s and 40s. And although the majority of women represented are childless, the first CSI introduced the character of Catherine Willows, a single mother, an ex-stripper who's become a successful CSI technician with a degree in medical technology. Catherine's desire to provide a good environment for her daughter to grow up in is represented as fueling her desire to succeed, while the logistics of balancing a high-pressure job with raising a child are represented as posing risks to Catherine and her daughter. And obviously, in the context of this TV drama, they're much more extreme risks than we might normally consider kidnapping, extortion, and the like. In the UK, Silent Witness was initially striking for its portrayal of Sam Ryan as a career woman, relatively content with her lot. In later series, however, this was undercut by representing her as regretting some of the choices she'd made with regard to career and children. This could be viewed as reneging on the values that made the character so appealing to audiences, or as a realistic representation of the ways in which social pressures can force women to reconsider such choices. And the tension between professional and personal obligations is still structurally a much more pressing issue for women than men because of the ways in which childcare and other caring responsibilities are allocated privately and due to the lack of public provision of resources. The majority of women in STEM in the dramas that we analysed are single and childless, and this seems to be a realistic reflection of the situation whereby women who want to succeed in STEM careers believe that this is likely to be at the cost of bearing and raising children. However, the US television series do seem to offer a more liberatory, and maybe not always plausible, approach to women in STEM, with Catherine Willows taking a degree in medical technology and becoming a CSI as a single mother and ex-stripper, and Angela Montenegro being employed in a publicly funded laboratory, having no track record of stable employment. In the UK TV series, however, it appears as if careers in STEM happen largely to the exclusion of parenthood or stable relationships and follow narrow institutional frameworks. So, in the early 21st century, when so-called feminine or soft skills have started to become valued in the workplace, the battle of the sexes is sometimes reworked through a reversal of binary gender stereotypes. This reworking is of particularly acute interest in the case of the representation of women scientists, where the attributes of womanhood and scientists already destabilise conventional understandings of acceptable behaviour. In Bones and Waking the Dead, as well as an earlier series of Silent Witness, where primary scientific expertise is located in the women characters, with the detective characters generally being male, this leads to an attribution of hyper-rationality to women and empathy to men. This reverses conventional stereotypes about gender at significant cost to the female characters, but generally to the benefit of male characters. And again, you can think about the X-Files as a precursor for this. So the abstracted women scientists are harshly judged by characters within the narrative when they demonstrate failures in empathy, and this judgment does seem to carry additional weight because of the role reversal. But this isn't always uncontested. For example, in Bones, much is made of the squints, of which Bones is one, their supposed inability to relate to other human beings appropriately. But the humour this stereotype offers is nuanced by a dialogue in exchanges in which Bones, for example, points out that a degree of abstraction is essential to the maintenance of her composure in the face of some of the horrific crimes she investigates in the course of her career. So TV drama series afford the opportunity to explore issues of expertise and emotion in relation to scientists and non-scientists. And again, we think it's worth noting that writers of such drama use such explorations in ways that both deploy and undermine gendered stereotypes and stereotypes about science. Conflicts organised around the opposition between emotion and reason are viewed by screenwriters as opportunities to represent vivid, realistic characters in whom their audiences believe and with whom they can identify. The US-based series CSI Bones, again, tend to use humour to a greater degree in the portrayal of such conflicts than do Silent Witness and Waking the Dead. And a number of British screenwriters interviewed for this research did remark that they'd wanted more gallows humour in their portrayals of forensic science than eventually was screened. So, this mention of screenwriters' reflections on the writing process brings me to a slightly more detailed examination of such production questions. We conducted telephone interviews with 6 members of the production teams of Silent Witness and Waking the Dead. Interviewees included the original creators of both series, as well as writers who worked on episodes at various points in the respective series' lives. So the creators of both the British series based their characters on women scientists. Nigel McCreary, the creator of Silent Witness, was a former policeman who'd been impressed with and inspired by the combination of humour, professional competence, and get this, glamour, of a senior forensic pathologist with whom he had worked. She was also a vital source in the creation of the first series, providing advice and reading and commenting on script drafts. For Barbara Macon, the creator of Waking the Dead, her main research contacts in her development of a new series just happened to be women. I think investigating the just happenedness of that is well worth doing. Anyway, that being the case, Macon went on to use an eminent senior forensic scientist attached to Scotland Yard as a role model for her drama. She says, actually, although my character Frankie was much younger than her, I very much modelled her attitude and her kind of strength and her feisty behaviour on the real woman. So I think this demonstrates a really interesting circuit of role modelling between the real and fictional women scientists and the potential viewers. The production teams of both Silent Witness and Waking the Dead had drawn the expertise of appropriate specialists, including pathologists, a criminal profile and police officers. But all the writers we interviewed stressed that while they consulted and drew on this advice, for dramatic purposes, it was sometimes necessary to push the bounds of plausibility. Yeah, I think I'm probably preaching to the choir here. And in the case of both series, the cooperation of eminent and personable women scientists of considerable seniority led the creators to establish representations of strong women scientists whom successive writers could work with, even if they didn't necessarily continue to draw on the services of women advisors as the series developed. So Barbara Macon, creator of Waking the Dead, says, I wanted to write a show about a team. Interestingly enough, there are loads of teams now, and CSI, of course, is the great team show. But CSI wasn't invented when I invented Waking the Dead, and so I wanted a team where actually the women were as strong as the men. So I created Frankie, and I created Grace the profiler, and she too was modelled on a woman who assisted in the research process, so they would be very strong leaders in the team. Just as an aside, however, she then goes on to note that Trevor Eve, the actor, was so kind of dominant in his presence that he became the lead character, somewhat against her original intention. So the writers interviewed were acutely aware of the challenges that professional women might face in a workplace imbued with a masculine culture, and were keen to represent those challenges. However, they also wanted to avoid any suggestion that they were being politically correct or writing to an agenda. They stressed the importance of realism and the need to represent characters as flawed and human. In fact, they felt that these flaws were important dramatic and realistic counterpoints to the expert nature and absolute focus of the work that women scientist characters they created or inherited did. As both the creator of Silent Witness and his collaborator Kevin Hood pointed out, creators and writers tend to establish characters and their settings and then move on, leaving the field clear for freelance writers to develop stories using the frameworks they provided. And this means that writers on later series have less motivation or freedom to change characters' traits. So, although the writers of Silent Witness interviewed were fairly resistant to the notion of characters in drama being written as role models, those interviewed, all men, expressed very strong commitments to doing justice to the representation of strong professional women. Nigel McCree's admiration for the combination of expertise, humour and humanity in the female pathologist on whom Sam Ryan was based was palpable in the interview. Barbara Macon was the only interviewee, and perhaps it's significant that she's a woman, who raised the issue of role models without prompting during the telephone interview. She had this to say: "To be a woman driving that field is also interesting because, in a sense, the public don't expect it because they have so many male role models. It's a much more provoking way." I think it's interesting that she said provoking rather than provocative, to look at your science, at the way a practitioner works. She added that she was delighted that Grace and Frankie might have become important role models, having a positive impact on recruitment to the profession. So the professional ethos of the male writers that we interviewed seemed to lead them to resist the idea of setting out to create characters who might act as role models. However, they took it for granted that women should be represented as competent professionals and that it was important to represent the challenges they faced as well. John Wiltshire, for example, said that he hoped that young female viewers of Silent Witness might take away the idea that such a career was a possibility open to them, but that also there might be cost to pursuing it. Our interviewees also made explicit references to the fact that the economic and professional routines of TV drama production impose constraints on decisions made about character representations as well as on character development, and they discussed their perception that TV drama produced in the USA was far better resourced, with writers paid much higher salaries and institutional commitments to representing diversity. However, it was also clear that when, often for contingent reasons, writers and producers engaged with female scientists, they found them inspiring and cooperative in the production process. Nearly there. So, conclusions and recommendations. The global distribution of an audience for long-running science-based dramas like the CSI franchise, as well as the dedicated following enjoyed by Silent Witness and Waking the Dead, demonstrates that there's a huge appetite for dramatic fiction, and is this a shock, that visualises science, engineering and technology and mathematics in compelling ways. The setting of such procedural dramas in the workplace, however atypical those workplaces might be, provides writers with ample opportunity to represent science and women scientists as both exceptional and ordinary. They're exceptional in their performance of STEM tasks, often in life or death situations, and they're ordinary in their navigation of workplace relationships and tensions and the balance of work lives and private lives. It seems, therefore, that such series provide both an opportunity and a template for the representation of women and STEM. They make science and technology both visually striking and relevant to the solution of life and death problems. They provide narrative opportunities to represent women in STEM in both personal and professional settings. And we said in our report, and you're already doing it, it would be worth considering applying such a template to other professions. And finally, because TV dramas can't do the work of equality alone, one of the recommendations that we thought would be useful was to produce teaching packs for audiences, for school-age audiences. Because the beauty of dramatic fiction, even when produced under institutional or commercial constraints, is its potential for nuanced and ambivalent representations, as well as the opportunity for its viewers to identify with its protagonists. Our research suggests, therefore, that it might be useful to develop teaching for schools and colleges in which diverse media representations of women in STEM are used to prompt class debate, develop group projects, or inspire individual reflection. These could, for example, include clips and workbooks encouraging students to compare and contrast the relative plausibility of dramas produced in the UK and the USA, or indeed Germany. They could also draw out the range of focus on the balance of professional to personal life for women in STEM. Extracts from some of the dramas analysed in this research could be used to provide diverse and multiple resources for students to compose their own role models or imagine career trajectories. And collective viewing of the plausible and implausible aspects, both of the science portrayed and of the social context in which it is represented, could also promote further reflection. It could provide the young people with opportunities to explore issues about life course decisions, work-life balance and gendered workplace interpersonal dynamics in a more richly textured way than would arise if they viewed them alone. We think that providing young viewers with the tools to critique the gendered representations in the screen dramas we've discussed, as well as with information on the real-life penetration of women into such professions, would be a valuable intervention. Thank you very much for listening.